Tonight, we begin with a development that Western intelligence officials had feared, anticipated, and desperately prepared for. A massive coordinated attack that unfolded not over days, but in hours. Hours that plunged millions into darkness. Hours that left hospitals running on emergency generators. Hours that turned the cold Ukrainian winter into a weapon of war. What Russia did today crossed a line that NATO had hoped would hold, and when that line broke, President Volodymyr Zelensky did not hesitate. He responded with urgency, clarity, and an emotional appeal that echoed through the halls of every Western capital. Tonight, we break down exactly what happened, why it happened now, and what Zelensky's urgent NATO plea means for the future of this war. For weeks now, there had been signals, not official statements, not formal diplomatic warnings, just signals that Russia was preparing something devastating. Russia has been aggressive, yes, but they have been calculated in their aggression. Their moves have followed a certain rhythm, a predictability, almost a pattern. But what set off alarm bells in Kyiv, Washington, and Brussels this week was that the pattern went silent. Military analysts who monitor Russian military activity know the indicators, the movement of mobile missile launchers, the repositioning of strategic bomber aircraft, the stockpiling of cruise missiles at forward bases, the sudden increase in encrypted military communications. All of that went quiet. And whenever Russia goes quiet, it means something is about to get loud. Intelligence services across NATO began warning their governments something big was coming. They didn't know the exact target. They didn't know the exact timing. But they knew the intent, and the intent was destruction. Early this morning, Ukrainian Air Force Command detected what they described as a massive coordinated missile barrage, including cruise missiles launched from strategic bombers that had not been deployed in over 3 months. These are the kinds of assets that Russia only deploys when they are signaling something very specific: escalation, intimidation, or strategic punishment. Western observers didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that Russia was changing its posture. And when a nuclear-armed nation shifts posture without explanation, even by small measures, NATO pays attention. Within minutes of the first launches being detected, air raid sirens wailed across Ukraine, from Kyiv to Kharkiv, from Odessa to Dnipro, from Lviv in the west to cities near the front lines in the east. The entire country braced for impact. The response issued by NATO tonight was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. Officials, after emergency security briefings, described Russia's move as unprecedented in scale, calculated in timing, and perhaps most importantly, deliberately designed to maximize civilian suffering during the coldest months of the year. But intimidation only works if the target hesitates. Ukraine did not. In fact, Zelensky's response today was among the most direct and emotional we've seen in this entire conflict. Here's what we know. Within hours of the first missile striking Ukrainian infrastructure, Zelensky addressed NATO leaders directly. This wasn't a routine update. This wasn't a scheduled briefing. This was an urgent plea, a call for immediate action that Zelensky delivered with visible frustration and undeniable passion. He asked for more air defense systems. He asked for faster delivery of promised weapons. And he asked NATO to understand that every day of delay costs Ukrainian lives. Tonight, Ukrainian officials confirmed that Russia launched over 120 missiles and drones targeting critical infrastructure across the country, including power plants that had recently been repaired after previous attacks. Russia struck before Ukraine could fully restore its power grid. They hit thermal power stations. They hit electrical substations. They hit heating facilities that millions of Ukrainians depend on to survive the winter. In other words, Russia targeted the backbone of civilian life, the infrastructure that keeps homes warm, hospitals running, and water flowing. This is what made Zelensky's plea so urgent. Russia's attack wasn't just symbolic, it was strategic. It represented the kind of assault that could collapse Ukrainian morale if left unanswered. And Zelensky, understanding that fully, responded with his most forceful appeal yet. Not with anger alone, not with desperation, but with strategic clarity. He didn't ask for sympathy. He didn't ask for thoughts and prayers. He asked for Patriot missile systems. He asked for NASAMS air defense units. He asked for the tools Ukraine needs to protect its people from Russian missiles. And here's where the story becomes even more significant. Western intelligence analysts now believe that Russia's latest attack was designed to test the resolve of NATO after months of debate about continued military aid. Russia wanted to see whether Western nations would waver, whether the coming winter would weaken European support. whether political divisions in Washington would slow the flow of weapons. But instead, the opposite happened. NATO didn't waver. They issued a joint statement that was so unified, so forceful, that even Moscow noticed. You don't get the Kremlin's attention easily. But today, Zelensky and NATO did. Defense analysts speaking with Western media under anonymity described Russia's escalation as a desperation move away to regain initiative after months of battlefield setbacks. But Zelensky proved today that Ukraine remains both resilient and defiant. His plea was not only emotional, it was calculated so precisely that it forced NATO leaders to confront an uncomfortable truth. Ukraine cannot defend itself against these attacks without more Western air defense systems. That truth matters because it shows the stakes of Western commitment. It shows that Zelensky is not merely asking for help. He is demanding accountability from allies who promised to stand with Ukraine. As reports continued coming in throughout the day, we learned more about the scale of Russia's attack. Russian strategic bombers carried out launches from multiple directions, forcing Ukrainian air defenses to spread thin across the country. Russian naval vessels in the Black Sea fired cruise missiles that had been repositioned in the last 72 hours. Russian drone units operating from Belarus reportedly launched Shade drones used by Russia to overwhelm Ukrainian defenses before the main missile wave arrived. This wasn't just an attack. This wasn't just escalation. This was coordinated destruction. This was strategic terror. And strategic terror is the one thing Russia has consistently used since the beginning of this invasion. For every battlefield loss they have suffered, Russia has countered with attacks on civilian infrastructure. For every territory they have lost, they have responded by making Ukrainian civilians pay the price. Remember, Russia thought Ukraine would fall in 3 days. They thought Kyiv would collapse without a fight. They thought the West would lose interest after a few months. They thought winter would break European resolve. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. Ukraine is still standing. The West is still providing support. And Zelensky is still fighting not just on the battlefield, but in the halls of NATO headquarters. This war has defied every Russian expectation. And tonight's brutal attack shows that Moscow is running out of options. What makes this moment so significant and so dangerous is that Russia's latest attack happened at a time when Vladimir Putin is under immense pressure. Military hardliners want more aggressive action. Russian oligarchs want an end to sanctions. The remnants of Wagner want revenge for the death of Prigozhin. Moderate voices in Moscow want a diplomatic off-ramp. Putin is balancing these demands while suffering continued losses on the battlefield. And when leaders in that position make sudden moves, they're not doing it from strength. They're doing it from pressure. They're doing it from vulnerability. Tonight's attack was not a show of Russian power. It was a sign of Russian desperation. NATO's statement, now circulated to all member states, was designed to signal that the alliance is not willing to abandon Ukraine. Officials said plainly that Russia's attack on civilian infrastructure was inconsistent with international humanitarian law. That is diplomatic language for this is a war crime and we will not ignore it. You don't usually hear that tone from NATO unless something serious is at stake. And tonight, the stakes could not be higher. Meanwhile, President Zelensky addressed the Ukrainian people in an emotional, defiant speech tonight. He said, "Russia wants us to freeze. They want us to suffer. They want us to surrender," he said. "We will not give them that satisfaction." And he said, "Every missile they fire at our infrastructure only strengthens our resolve to fight back." These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a leader who understands just how high the stakes have become. Zelensky knows that Ukraine's survival depends on Western support. And tonight, he made that case more forcefully than ever before. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. Russia's latest attack wasn't isolated. Along with the missile barrage, Russian cyber units also launched attacks on Ukrainian government websites. Russian propaganda channels increased disinformation targeting European audiences. Russian diplomatic officials issued veiled threats about consequences for continued Western support. All of this happened within the same 24-hour period. When Russia moves multiple pieces at once, it means something larger is underway. Western analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that Russia is preparing a winter offensive designed to capitalize on infrastructure destruction. Another is that Russia is attempting to create a humanitarian crisis that forces Ukraine to the negotiating table. A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that Russia is testing whether NATO will escalate its support or back down. But today, Zelensky took that question off the table. He didn't ask politely. He didn't wait for bureaucratic processes. He didn't accept half measures. He Zelensky demanded action. What we're watching now is a test of resolve. Russia wants to see if winter will break Western unity. Ukraine wants to show that it can survive anything Moscow throws at it. NATO wants to prevent this war from escalating further. And the world is watching to see which side blinks first. Tonight, we've heard from Pentagon officials who are now monitoring Russian military movements closely. They say additional missile launches are possible in the coming days. They say Russia has sufficient stockpiles for sustained attacks, and they say Russia's decision to target infrastructure is likely part of a broader winter strategy intended to break Ukrainian morale. But Ukraine is not breaking. In fact, Ukraine is adapting. Their response today, urgent, unified, and defiant, sent a message to Russia that attacks on civilians will not force surrender. And it sent a message to NATO that Ukraine needs more support, and it needs it now. As the coming days unfold, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Russia hoped to achieve with today's attack. But what we do know is that Zelensky's urgent plea was timely. It reminded NATO of its commitments. It exposed Russian desperation, and it unified Western leaders around a common purpose. What happens next will depend on what Russia does in the next 48 hours. If they continue these attacks, this moment will be remembered as a turning point. If they pause, NATO and Ukraine have already shown they are prepared for whatever comes next. They have shown they are ready to respond, and tonight, for the first time in months, the Kremlin appears to be recalculating. Moscow is quiet, too quiet, and when Russia is quiet, it means they are thinking. It means they are choosing their next move carefully. Because tonight, Russia learned something they should have learned long ago. Ukraine will not break. NATO will not abandon its ally. And attacks on civilians will only strengthen the world's resolve to see Russia defeated. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is clear. Zelensky's plea was heard. NATO's response is coming. And Russia's brutal strategy is failing. And we will be here watching every detail as the next phase unfolds.